Look, I headed the Navy's anti-terrorism unit. I was on the ground in Afghanistan for a short mission when I was head of it. We were hunting terrorists. But we know since 9/11, we no longer just have away games, wars overseas. We also know after 9/11 that our first responders have to take care of efforts here at home also. I do believe about reasonable laws that ensure criminals, including the worst of criminals, terrorists, cannot gain access to weapons. Government should be reasonable. It shouldn't intervene in private life decisions of families that are making. But when you know someone's on a watch list to be a terrorist, yes, we should ensure that they do not get access to a weapon.
I think we should make sure we have a very sophisticated and adequate background check mechanism to make sure that terrorists, certainly, and other dangerous people, and certainly criminals, don't have access to guns. I would not support restricting the rights of law-abiding citizens, however. And I think that's a very important distinction. We talked about terrorists, and this raises another very big distinction between Joe and I. An example of just how extreme Joe Sestak is. My view, when we capture an enemy combatant, a foreign terrorist on foreign soil, trying to kill Americans, we should give that person a military trial in a military tribunal on a military base. Joe Sestak is about all alone among any elected official that I know of in Pennsylvania who believes that even Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the admitted mastermind of 9/11, should be given a civilian trial, including here in Pennsylvania. And Joe's been adamant about that. I think that is extremely irresponsible, it's dangerous, and it's a compromise to our security.
George, I am unique among those who have been elected to the Congress. I walked out of the Pentagon on 9/11, and 25 minutes later, a plane slammed into that building. Men and women who had worked for me never came out. I went on the ground in Afghanistan, headed the Navy's anti-terrorism show, short mission. And the fact that those criminals are still sitting down there, if the Supreme Court said we could not bring them to justice, I want them brought to justice in Washington, D.C., where they killed my friends. George Bush brought in 200 terrorists to be tried here in America. I defended those laws. They're strong enough to do it. I want them put to death for what they did.
Except that what Joe Sestak is advocating is a huge risk for the United States, a security risk wherever the trial were to be conducted. This would be a circus. It would be very dangerous. Who knows what terrorists would try to do to disrupt the proceedings, how much it would cost, certainly in money, but perhaps even in lives. But even bigger than that, in a civilian trial, the prosecution is required to disclose to the defense its methods, its information, where it got it, and what it knows. I don't think we're under any obligation to help our enemies kill Americans. And disclosing that kind of information to the very mastermind of 9/11 would be incredibly imprudent, if you ask me.
Back to the economy for a moment, gentlemen.
I have 30-second response. Sir, but that was the rules, please. It was the rules. Thank you.
Well, no, you've had your rebuttal.
No, I was the first one.
You've had your rebuttal.
You had your question and you got the rebuttal. You each had 60 seconds. You each got a 30-second rebuttal.
Yeah, sorry, my apologies.
No, hold on. I'm getting another message. Say it again.
I did not have the 30 seconds.
I apologize. You do have a rebuttal.
Or thank you. Sorry for being persistent. That's not true. Courts do not, civilian courts, have to reveal that. In fact, George Bush tried 200 terrorists, 200 of them here, and he never spoke up. Look, we have to get these terrorists tried. The Supreme Court is just letting them sit down there in Gitmo. If George Bush could have 200, why didn't he speak up then? Why now during an election? And yes, I don't care what other politicians say. I'm a public servant who knows to do what I believe is right, to get them to be tried here and get the keys thrown away or put to death.
I know producers are almost never wrong, but they were this time.
You get another 30 seconds.
Mr. Toomey, you do get another 30 seconds.
Well, I just think it's abundantly clear this is a huge security risk. This has been exhaustively explained. Again, I think it's part of the reason that the law enforcement community of Pennsylvania is endorsing my candidacy after hearing both Joe Sestak and myself present our arguments to them. and I'm grateful for their support.
All right, let's get back to the economy for a second. Would the American economy be in better shape today had there been no bailout of Wall Street and the automobile industry? Clearly, the deficit wouldn't be as high as it is today, but are there in fact companies and industries that are simply too big to be allowed to fail? And I ask that question first to Mr. Toomey.
Well, as you know, if you've watched any TV and seen any of Joe's ads, I worked on Wall Street. I left Wall Street 20 years ago. And one of the things that I learned then was that's the last place that taxpayers should have to bail out. When I got to Congress, one of the things I did very early on was I started to raise a red flag about my concerns with the imprudent management of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. I raised the question about the implicit government guarantee, the question of whether that would allow them to grow too big, and whether taxpayers would eventually have to bail them out. I went further. I sponsored legislation that would have meant real regulatory reform, capital requirements, portfolio limits, tough regulations, so that Fannie and Freddie might never have spun out of control. In fact, if that legislation had been passed, I think it's very unlikely that they ever would have reached the size or scale that ended up being so disastrous. In 2007, when Joe Sestak got to Congress, unfortunately joined forces with the most liberal wing of his conference, stood there with Barney Frank, voted against common sense measures that might have restricted the size and scope of Fannie and Freddie. They famously decided to roll the dice. And now taxpayers have had to put $148 billion into Fannie and Freddie, and there's no end in sight.
I arrived in Congress the year the recession began. The economists said we were headed for a depression. We had doubled our national debt under the Toomey-Bush era, from $4.5 trillion to $11 trillion. In the last 6 months of George Bush's tenure, we had lost 3 million jobs. We were sinking. Much like we had to in the Navy, I had to control the damage of the Bush-Toomey era. Those were tough votes. We'd been torpedoed. The ship was sinking. We had to caulk the holes. 700,000 people were losing their jobs every month. In the last 9 months, we created almost 1 million jobs. Is it perfect? No. But sometimes you have to take care of other people's messes and just clean them up. What we can't do is have Congressman Toomey, who left Congress and became a lobbyist for a Wall Street-founded special interest group, and went on television and said deficits aren't important. And so he wants to take Social Security, put it into Wall Street, where he came from, where he still fights for them, and borrow the money to keep Social Security solvent from the Chinese. That's the difference.
Joe has voted for every single bailout that has come down the pike, and there are no exceptions. And even after he voted for Fannie and Freddie's bailout and the big Wall Street bailouts and the car company bailouts, after a majority of members of the House, including 99 Democrats, voted to finally bring an end to that TARP program, not Joe. Joe voted to continue the bailouts. And Joe says, oh, he had to do it. Well, he had to introduce his own bailout bill. Joe's the only sponsor of that bill, but it's a bill that would require taxpayers to bail out underwater mortgages. There is no end to bailouts with Joe. I think this happens sometimes with people who have no experience in business and don't realize that this is a total misallocation of resources, this is unfair to taxpayers, and this is not good for our economy.
Congressman Toomey said if we hadn't done what we had to do, there would have been a slightly harder down. Yes, John McCain's economist told us what it was, Mark Zandi. Another 8 million people unemployed, right out that torpedo hole. Yes, you're right, there are Democrats that didn't have the courage of their conviction to do what was necessary. That's why I'll always stand up, as you point out, for doing what's right, not to the consequences of my job, but to save jobs of Americans. Congressman Toomey, explain to us why. You believe corporations should have zero taxes, no taxes for AIG, who you said they should keep their bonuses after they ripped us off, and yet you voted against bonuses for our veterans fighting in Iraq. Tell me why that $300 billion you want to give to corporations for zero taxes shouldn't be given to small businesses.
Vernon, you get the next question.
Mr. Toomey, Mr. Sestak, I'm sorry. Pentagon spending. You fought a few wars overseas and a few inside the Pentagon about budgets and things like that, modernizing. Are you satisfied with where the Pentagon is spending-wise now and the fat's been cut out of there? And what would you change specifically if you are elected and have a shot at it up there?
No.